Well, thank you very much for this kind introduction. It's a great honor to be here and to share this knowledge that I gathered over the past 3 decades with all of you and perhaps beyond. So The Journey of Humanity, the book that I recently released in various countries around the world, is an attempt to explore the evolution of human societies since the emergence of anatomically modern human in Africa nearly 300,000 years ago. As will become apparent, this is an attempt to explore 2 of the most fundamental mysteries that surrounds this journey. The first one is the mystery of growth, namely, what are the roots of the dramatic transformation in living standards that occurred in the past 200 years after hundreds of thousands of years of stagnation? And the second one is the mystery of inequality, namely, what are the roots of inequality in the wealth of nations? Now, over most of human existence, human life, as suggested by Hobbes, was nasty, brutish, and short. In fact, humans had remarkably similar life to that of other species on planet Earth. Humans were preoccupied by survival and reproduction. Living standards were very close to the subsistence level, and living conditions across planet Earth were relatively similar across time and across space. In fact, only a few centuries ago, 1/4 of newborn did not reach their first birthday, and about 1/2 of them did not reach their reproductive age. In addition, numerous women perished during childbirth. Life expectancy fluctuated in a very narrow range of 25 to 40 and rarely exceeded 40. And perhaps more strikingly, an economic crisis did not lead into belt-tightening, but rather into mass starvation and ultimately extinction. And then, in the past 200 years, we see this incredible metamorphosis, an incredible improvement in the standard of living on planet Earth. In fact, over the past 2 centuries, we see that income per capita in the world as a whole is increasing by a factor of 14. Life expectancy on planet Earth has more than doubled, and a great divergence took place in living conditions across time and across space. Now, in order to understand this metamorphosis, consider for a moment residents of Jerusalem at the time of Jesus, 2,000 years ago, and whisk them in a time machine forward to Ottoman-ruled Jerusalem at the beginning of the 19th century. Despite this 2,000-year jump in human history, these individuals will be able to adjust instantaneously to the new environment. And why is it so? Because past knowledge will be largely applicable. Technological improvements would be merely incremental and would permit an instantaneous adaptation to the technological environment. Occupations would require very similar skills. And perhaps most importantly, life expectancy would remain unchanged and would not require a reorientation of individuals' mindset. But now, take these individuals from Jerusalem in the Ottoman period, the beginning of the 19th century, and whisk them in a time machine forward to contemporary Jerusalem in the 21st century. Only 200-year jump forward. In this case, individuals would be shocked. Individuals will be entirely devastated. And why is it so? Because past knowledge would be largely obsolete. Technologies, modern technologies, would appear as witchcraft. Occupations would require incomprehensible skills. And life expectancy would instantly double and would require a future-oriented mindset. A mindset that can make decisions about education, a mindset that can make decisions about saving and investment, a mindset that can make decisions in light of the fact that the life cycle is very different than what existed in the past. So something very dramatic occurred in the past 200 years, something that had not occurred over most of human history. So in fact, if you think about the evolution of living standards in the course of human history, it is quite apparent that living standards had not increased incrementally in the course of human history. In contrast to the view that is advanced in popular science books about incremental change in living standards in the past, say, 12,000 years since the Neolithic Revolution, in fact, living standards are hardly changing over the course of human existence. Over 99.9% of human existence, there is hardly any change in living standard across the globe. What we do see is technological improvement. Technological improvement is taking place, and in fact, this is an incremental process, accelerating over time. But importantly, technological progress is not affecting the well-being of the population, it is simply affecting the size of the population. Technological progress is converted into more people rather than into richer people. And in fact, if you think about this recent metamorphosis, namely the recent rise in income per capita, 14-fold increase in the world as a whole, in fact, this reflects an abrupt transformation that occurred once a tipping point has been reached. So in order to conceptualize this change, focus for a moment on the evolution of income per capita in the past 2,000 years. As you can see in the graph in front of you, in fact, there are hardly any changes in living standards till about the eve of industrialization. And then we see this tremendous spike in living standards in the past 2 centuries, 14-fold on average, but great variations across the globe. And in fact, if I would remove the labels from this graph, if I would remove the label from the x-axis and the y-axis, and I will show this graph to a random scientist, most people would argue that this is a graph that detects tectonic activities, detects a major eruption that occurs suddenly in the course of human history. But in fact, what you see in front of you is in fact the evolution of income per capita. Income per capita, as I said, is held by Malthusian forces over most of human history, and then suddenly we see this major eruption that occurred in the past 200 years. Now importantly, at the time of this takeoff, the takeoff does not occur across the globe as a whole. Some societies are experiencing this takeoff as early as 17th and 18th century, others only very recently. And since this takeoff is associated with a 14-fold increase in income per capita in the world as a whole, an enormous divergence is occurring across the globe. Those societies that are taking off first are magnifying their income per capita, others are staying behind, and consequently an enormous divergence is occurring in the world economy. This is very important because it implies that much of the inequality that we see across the globe today is originated nearly 200 years ago at the time of this differential takeoff. And therefore, if we would like to understand the roots of inequality today, we have to search for forces that operated in the distant past, hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago, and as you will see, even tens of thousands of years ago. Now, the resolution of these two fundamental mysteries is very important, but it requires the identification of the forces that permitted the takeoff from stagnation to growth in general, the forces that permitted the differential takeoff across the globe, namely permitted is takeoff in some societies and not in others, and would require a better understanding of the role of deep-rooted factors, historical forces, and even prehistorical forces in the evolution of society across the globe. And the resolution of these mysteries is fundamental if we would like to alleviate inequality across the globe. We would like to see narrowing inequality across the globe. We have to have a better understanding of these fundamental forces that brought about the divergence in income per capita as we see it today. So this implies that in order to resolve these mysteries, we have to have a better understanding of the journey of humanity. Namely, we have to have a better understanding of how humanity marched in the course of human history. And it turns out that the process of development can be divided into three fundamental phases. The first one will be defined as the Malthusian epoch, the second one as the post-Malthusian regime, and the third one, the modern growth regime. Now, the Malthusian epoch emerges during the emergence of anatomically modern human in Africa nearly 300,000 years ago, and it spans 99.9% of human existence. And the Malthusian epoch is characterized by very interesting dualism: stagnation along with dynamism. And it is this dynamism that ultimately permits the world to move into the post-Malthusian regime, namely to escape the Malthusian trap and ultimately to take off into what I defined as the post-Malthusian regime. But during the post-Malthusian regime, still Malthusian forces are preventing income per capita from marching forward without being counterbalanced by population growth. And consequently, ultimately, it is the demographic transition that occurred in the post-1870 period in Western Europe that is freeing the growth process from the counterbalancing effect of population and permits the world to sail into the sustained growth regime. So as I said, key to the understanding of inequality in the world today are the forces that operated during the Malthusian era. And during the Malthusian era, we see, as I said, very interesting dualism: stagnation along with dynamism. We see stagnation in income per capita that fluctuates around a constant level for a prolonged period of time. And we see stagnation in life expectancy that fluctuates in a narrow range of 25 to 40. But at the same time, we see dynamism. We see dynamism in the context of technology. We see dynamism in the context of population. And we see dynamism in the context of human adaptation. At any point in time, what I define as dynamism is negligible. Technological progress is very, very, very slow. Population growth is very, very small. And human adaptation is very slow. But over 300,000 year period since the emergence of humans, this amounts to a tremendous shift in the technological landscape, in the scale of the human population, and in the adaptation of the human population to the new technological environment. And it is this Malthusian dynamism that ultimately triggers the transition from stagnation to growth, and ultimately the transition to the modern growth. Now, importantly, it is very critical to have an understanding of the wheels of change that are governing the journey of humanity. And when we think about the wheels of change, there are three of them: technological progress, the scale of the human population, and the adaptation of the human population. So, when technology is evolving during the Malthusian epoch, it increases income per capita temporarily, provides people with more resources than that existed otherwise. But this is not long-lasting. Why is it so? Because population is growing due to the fact that more children survive and many more of them are born, and consequently income per capita reverts necessarily to the previous equilibrium position. So technological progress, unlike today's world, is generating a temporary increase in income per capita, but ultimately it boosts population growth, and consequently income per capita is reverting back to the previous equilibrium position. Now this generates powerful predictions, powerful testable predictions. It implies that during the era that preceded the modern growth regime, technologically advanced societies or land-rich societies were not richer, but simply had higher population density. And the evidence is striking with this respect. So if you look, for instance, at the relationship in the x-axis between land productivity and population density in the Middle Ages, we see that societies that have greater land productivity in fact, have higher population density. But that's not surprising. We wouldn't expect population density in the Sahara Desert to be as large as in the fertile areas of Europe. What is surprising is that there is no relationship between land productivity and income per capita. Namely, those societies that are more productive are ultimately having higher population density but not richer people. And the same is true for technological progress. When technological progress is taking place, it is converted into more people rather than into richer people. So this is a fundamental insight about the way that the world is operating over most of human existence. And this is a link that is very critical for the understanding of the transition from stagnation to growth first, and second, the mystery of inequality. Namely, why do we see this enormous inequality in the wealth of nations across the globe? The second element that is very important in the context of the Malthusian epoch is the effect of technological progress on human adaptation, predominantly cultural adaptation. So as I said, the Malthusian pressure is affecting the size of the population. When technology advances, more people survive. But in addition, it affects the composition of the population. Namely, it affects the type of traits that are being selected. So traits, whether they are cultural or individuals, that were complementary to the technological environment, tautologically generated higher income. But higher income during the Malthusian epoch is converted into higher reproductive success. And this implies that these cultural traits are held by a larger number of people. Namely, it implies that these traits are becoming more and more prevalent in the population. So during the Malthusian epoch, adaptation is taking place, and this adaptation raised the prevalence of adaptive traits in the population and ultimately reinforced the transition from stagnation to growth. So this is the second important element that operates in the Malthusian epoch. And the third one has to do with the origin of technological progress. Technological progress naturally is not manna from heaven. It is affected by the size of the population and by the adaptation of the population. If the size of the population is larger than otherwise, we have more potential innovators, and as a result of it, technologies advance more rapidly than otherwise. We have more demand for innovations, and again, the incentive to innovate will be larger than otherwise. It will increase the diffusion of labor, the diffusion of knowledge. It will increase the division of labor, and through this division, learning by doing and technological progress, and it will magnify the extent of trade and via reverse engineering technological progress. So what we see in the course of human history, particularly during the Malthusian epoch, is that the size of the human population and the composition of the human population affects technological progress. More people, more adaptable people, greater technological progress. But at the same time, technological progress in turn affects the size of the human population and the composition of the human population. Why is it important? Because this is a positive feedback loop. It means that when we start in Africa 300,000 years ago with a certain population, this population generates technological progress that supports larger population, that supports greater technological progress, and this reinforcing interaction ultimately brings about technological acceleration of the scale that we see during the Industrial Revolution. Namely, the world is moving from stone tool technologies that existed 300,000 years ago to steam engine technologies in the eve of industrialization. Now, why is it so important? Because when technological progress is taking place and the technological landscape is changing very rapidly, human capital, education becomes essential to allow individuals to cope with this rapidly changing technological environment. But individuals are too poor to invest in the education of their children without economizing on other elements in their budget constraint. They cannot economize on their consumption because their consumption is very close to subsistence. So they have to economize on the number of children. Namely, human capital becomes essential, and consequently, human capital formation triggers a massive decline in fertility, the so-called demographic transition. This decline in fertility frees the growth process from the counterbalancing effect of population, and the Malthusian equilibrium simply vanishes. Namely, this counterbalancing effect of population are no longer in place because, in fact, in order to invest in human capital, in order to invest in the education of their kids, people must economize on the number of children that we have. We see a dramatic decline in fertility that frees the growth process from the counterbalancing effect of population. And consequently, if you wish, the holy triangle, technological progress, human capital formation, and the decline in population growth are contributing to the movement into the sustained growth regime. So let me illustrate it in a very simple fashion. What you can see in the graph in front of you are the three wheels of change: the size of the human population, the adaptation or the composition of the human population, and technological progress. Humanity starts in Africa 300,000 years ago. The size of the human population is modest. But despite the size of the human population, there is an important advantage of the human species over other species, which is the human brain. And the human brain is permitting ingenuity that permits technology to be advanced. So this modest population is advancing the technological frontier. The technological frontier at the time is not the type of the technological frontier that we experience at the moment, but nevertheless, the technological frontier at the time is moving slowly but surely over the course of human history. We move from one stone tool to another stone tool to another stone tool. And these wheels of change are reinforcing one another. And inevitably, after 300,000 year period, the size of the human population increases dramatically. In fact, the size of the human population in the past 12,000 years since the Neolithic Revolution increases 400-fold, from 2.5 million in the eve of the agricultural revolution to about 1 billion people in the midst of industrialization. And as I said earlier, technological progress is accelerating, and we're moving from stone tool technology to steam engine technology. And once we reach this space of technological progress, suddenly the technological landscape in which people are operating is changing too rapidly, and consequently individuals start to invest in the education of their children so as to equip them with tools that would permit them to navigate this stormy technological environment. This does not exist earlier because the technology is not evolving very rapidly, but as I said, sooner or later, technological progress is rapid enough so as to create this change. And once this change is taking place, a demographic transition is taking place. namely fertility starts to decline, the counterbalancing effect of population dissipates, and the world is sailing into the sustained growth regime. Now, it is very important to think about this transition in the context of a very simple metaphor that is familiar to all of us, namely the transition between liquid and gas as we heat water in a tea kettle. So as you know, if we place water on the stove and we heat the water, initially we do not see much change in the nature of the water. They remain in a liquid form. But ultimately, once the water are reaching a critical threshold of 100 degrees Celsius, we see the process of evaporation, we see the process of a phase transition. We move from one phase, liquid, into another phase, which is gas. The same holds in the course of human history. Over most of human history, societies, since the Neolithic Revolution, are agricultural societies. But nevertheless, in this period, we see that technological progress is getting faster and faster and faster. Despite the fact that the technological progress is getting faster, we don't see any changes in the well-being of the population because, as I said before, population growth counterbalances any potential impact on income per capita. But ultimately, sooner or later, technological progress becomes so rapid so as to induce investment in human capital, so as to trigger a fertility decline, and so as to cause the Malthusian equilibrium to evaporate, and the world is gravitated towards the modern growth regime. So the phase transition that you see in this context is basically based on the idea of bifurcation theory, that as certain parameters are moving forward in the course of human history, at a certain point there is a qualitative change in the nature of the system. Certain equilibrium, the Malthusian equilibrium, simply vanishes and we move into the modern growth equilibrium. But here is a very important and key insight. When you think about water and the evaporation process, you must have noticed that not all water molecules are evaporating at once. Some are evaporating earlier than others. And as a result of it, if you wish, there is inequality among water molecules. Some of them are in a gas state and others in a liquid state. The same holds in the world economy. Some societies are taking off earlier, others remain in the Malthusian equilibrium, and an enormous gap is emerging in the world economy. And naturally, in the context of the gas-water metaphor, it is important to note that those molecules that are moving from liquid to gas earlier has to do with random elements, partly, but mostly with the location of these water molecules within the teapot. The same is true in the course of human history. Your geographical location affects the timing of the takeoff and therefore ultimately the inequality that we see across the globe. So when we think about the roots of inequality across the globe, as I said, the inequality that we see in the world today is originated predominantly in this differential takeoff that occurred in the past 200 years. But in fact, this differential takeoff is originated or predicated on forces that operated much earlier on in human history, hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago, and even tens of thousands of years ago. So when we think about uneven development or inequality across the globe today, it is tempting to think about cross-country differences in human capital accumulation, education, cross-country differences in physical capital accumulation, the use of machines, and cross-country differences in technological level that can explain this gap. But this doesn't take us anywhere. This is just taking us into the question, so if this is the case, if we see a gap in education, in technology, and in the use of machine, Why is it the case that some societies fail to invest properly and efficiently in physical and human capital, and why societies fail to adopt advanced technologies? And this takes us into the important question, namely, what are the historical and prehistorical barriers in the process of accumulation? Why is it the case that some societies cannot participate in this process of accumulation and technological adoption? What are these historical forces that are generating this liability over time? And this leads us into the thought about deep-rooted factors, factors that operated in the distant past, institutions and cultural characteristics. But naturally, institutions and cultural characteristics are not manna from heaven. They are themselves predicated on economic development that is based on what I will define the ultimate forces, namely geographical forces and societal characteristics. And this is what I would like to explore, and this is what I explore in the second part of the book. So the book has this interesting feature. Initially, I start in Africa 300,000 years ago, and I march forward so as to understand the roots of inequality today. But ultimately, I reverse the course in the second part of the book. I start with inequality today, and I try to peel gradually different layers of influence so as to understand the roots of this inequality. I start with colonialism, institutions, culture, geography, and ultimately back to Africa, to the exodus of humans and the impact of the exodus of humans from Africa on human diversity. So let's start with institutions. As you know, many propose that institutions are critical forces in the inequality that we see across the globe. And indeed, we see the emergence of differential institutions across societies. Some societies are adopting growth-enhancing, inclusive institutions. Others are adopting growth-retarding, extractive institutions. And these differential institutions can explain some of the differences in inequality today across the globe. Now, naturally, from time to time, institutions are emerging out of the blue. They are emerging randomly at some critical juncture. But these instances are very small. So we can think about, for instance, the Black Death. The Black Death, to a large extent, is a random event that is affecting the European population quite tremendously in the middle of the 14th century and generate enormous labor scarcity. This labor scarcity increases the demand for labor and consequently causes the decline in feudalism in England. This decline in feudalism increases property rights in general, and some argue that it contributed ultimately into industrialization and the early onset of the Industrial Revolution in England. So this is a critical juncture in which institutions are very important. Another important example is the Glorious Revolution. And the Glorious Revolution, as you know, is leading into the establishment of constitutional monarchy in England, the establishment of property rights, and again, perhaps, early industrialization in England. So certainly, one can think about a counterfactual history in which Williams of Orange would be defeated by James II, the Glorious Revolution would not take place, England would remain an absolute monarchy, and industrialization would have occurred elsewhere rather than in England. So these are critical junctures that are very important. And the final one, and perhaps the most conspicuous one, is the division of the Korean Peninsula along the 38th parallel. Naturally, this is quite capricious and random. But this division is leading into an enormous gap in income per capita between South Korea and North Korea. In South Korea, income per capita is 24 times larger than in the North, and life expectancy is 11 years longer than in the North. So again, one can consider a counterfactual history in which the South would be a sphere of influence of capitalism. The North would be a sphere of influence of Western doctrines, and we will see a reversal in this pattern. But overall, the number of cases in which institutions are emerging randomly at critical junctures is very, very small. Mostly, institutions evolve gradually in the process of development. In fact, they're adapting to the technological environment. They're adapting to the geographical environment. So, for instance, the Neolithic Revolution or the Agricultural Revolution is naturally leading into higher population density, is leading into city formation, state formation, and consequently is generating a demand for institutions that can permit cooperation across individuals, establish property rights, and permit the implementation of public goods. Ecological diversity is known to be associated with greater amount of trade, and at the same time is known to be associated with an earlier state formation, and consequently again is associated with an increase in the demand and the supply of institutions. Another critical geographical factor is the suitability of land for large plantations. So some regions of the world can cultivate crops that are suitable for large plantations. Why is it so important? Because suitability of land for large plantation is generating concentration of land ownership, increases the political power of landowners, and ultimately permit the implementation of extractive institutions and even the horrific institutions of slavery. Or if you think about the disease environment, particularly harsh disease environment, this generated typically in Africa low population density, and they delayed the implementation of centralized political institutions. So again, geography to a large extent is behind differential institutions across the globe. So if we want to understand inequality across the globe, from time to time we will have to understand these critical junctures in which institutions are developing differentially across the globe, but predominantly we will have to resort to deeper forces, geographical forces, and as you will see, characteristics at the level of the society. So this takes us into the cultural factor. So we peel one layer of influence, which is institutions, and now we move into the second one, namely the force of culture. And again, if we think about cultural characteristics, we see the emergence of differential cultural characteristics across the globe. Some societies are adopting cultural characteristics that are growth enhancing, for instance, social capital. Other societies are adopting cultural characteristics that are growth retarding, for instance, family ties. And in fact, if you think about the Italian divide, the fact that within Italy we see greater prosperity in the north and in the south, despite the fact that Italy is naturally enjoying the same type of institutions, we have to resort to the cultural argument to understand this gap. And in fact, in southern Italy, we see the adoption of these cultural traits that is known as family ties, strong family ties that prevents transactions outside of the family and are ultimately harmful for economic growth. And we see that in the north, social capital is emerging in the form of generalized trust and in the form of civic participation. But again, if you think about culture, there are rare examples of random cultural mutation that occurred in human history. Perhaps the most prominent example in this sense is the imposition of mandatory literacy requirement in Judaism in the 1st century CE. This imposition led into the persistence of the predisposition towards education. Initially, this decree had no relevance for economic well-being. It was entirely capricious, entirely religion. But ultimately, it turned out that human capital was very complementary to traits and occupations in the urban environment, and as a result of it, this predisposition towards education persisted over time. So this is one example. A second example is the emphasis on thrift and entrepreneurship in the course of the Protestant Reformation. Again, this is associated by many with the spirit of capitalism. So there are some instances, random mutation, that are generating cultural traits, but again, they're very, very rare. In most cases, culture is adapting to the geographical environment. So, if you think about this process, culture largely evolved and adapted, as I said, to the environment. For instance, when there was an increase in the return to education, we see that there is a gradual change in the predisposition of societies towards education. Parents are more predisposed to invest in the quality of their children rather than the quality. Second, we think about the suitability of the land for the use of the plow. This suitability led to the implementation of the plow, but since the plow required upper body strength, it generated a gender division of labor that persisted till today and generated gender biases as we see today. Or if you think about climatic volatility, climatic volatility affected the degree of loss aversion in society and consequently affected the degree of entrepreneurship across society. And finally, if you think about crop yield, some societies are blessed with crops that have enormous amount of yield, other societies do not. Why is it very important? Because if you have large crop yield, it induces you to be engaged in a process of planting and then ultimately harvesting. And this implies that it basically induces long-term oriented behavior. Namely, it allows people to understand how to delay gratification, how to plan for the future, and this geographical endowment is associated with greater long-term orientation. And if you look at caloric suitability of land, namely how much calories can we extract from the land across planet Earth, it differs greatly. And if you focus for a moment on the map, just on the old world, you can see that in Southeast Asia, the lighter color reflects greater soil suitability. And you can see it both in Southeast Asia and in Europe. And this ultimately contributes greatly to long-term oriented behavior, future-oriented behavior, that is a critical trait in the growth process because it governs investment decisions, technological adoption, and education decisions. So again, just to summarize, cultural forces are important, but in fact, predominantly they are associated with deeper forces, forces that are predominantly geographical and societal. And this leads us into the so-called shadow of geography, namely geographical characteristics such as soil characteristics, the disease environment and isolation, and the impact, the indirect impact on the emergence of cultural characteristics, institutional characteristics that are important for economic growth. Now, admittedly, geographical characteristics have a direct impact on economic development. Naturally, if you suffer from the disease environment today, it will affect your labor productivity today, human capital formation today, and if you suffer from isolation, it will affect trade and technological progress. But this is not the indirect effect. This is not the long shadow of history that I'm referring to. The long shadow of history is operating through the effect of geography on institutional characteristics and cultural characteristics. Now, our occupation with geographical characteristics is ultimately taking us back in human history 12,000 years to the eve of the agricultural revolution. And during the agricultural revolution, we see the transition of societies from hunting and gathering tribes to sedentary agricultural communities. And this is an incredibly important transition, because this transition is associated with an increase in food production that permits the emergence of a non-food producing class, namely individuals that can devote their time to knowledge creation in the form of science, in the form of technology, and in the form of written languages. Why is it so important? Because at the moment that you engage in this knowledge formation, you develop new technologies and you generate a technological head start that will persist over time, and it gives you an edge over nearby societies. So famously, Jared Diamond, in his book Guns, Germs and Steels, suggests that much of the inequality across the globe today can be traced to these variations in the timing of the Neolithic across the globe. Those societies that moved into the Neolithic earlier generated this technological head start that persists to this very day. But in fact, it turns out that the evidence regarding the Diamond hypothesis are conflicting. Namely, in fact, the timing of the Neolithic Revolution is very important for the understanding of comparative development in the Middle Ages, but it is entirely irrelevant for the understanding of comparative development today. Namely, inequality today cannot be mapped into the timing of the Neolithic Revolution. And you can see it quite clearly in the map in front of you. Look at the societies that experienced the Neolithic Revolution earlier, namely the Fertile Crescent, Europe, and Southeast Asia. You can see quite clearly that these societies are not necessarily the societies that are dominating the world today. Namely, within the European continent, the Neolithic Revolution occurred earlier in the south than in the north, and the north is dominating the south economically. And if you think about the world as a whole, naturally, China is not dominating the world, and societies in the Middle East are not dominating the world. So what happened is that in the course of globalization, in the course of a process in which trade started to take place, societies that had comparative advantage in agriculture locked themselves into agriculture, and since agriculture has limited technological spillover in comparison to the urban sector, it generated a comparative disadvantage in technological progress and human capital formation that mitigated the technological head start that was alluded to by Jared Diamond. So again, the Neolithic Revolution is not the explanation for the inequality that we see across the globe. And this takes us ultimately back all the way to Africa. So as you may know, humans are departing from Africa, starting to populate the world 60 to 90,000 years ago. And this migration of Homo sapiens out of Africa is affecting the distribution of population diversity across the globe. And ultimately, it affects comparative development, as I will show you momentarily. And why is it so? So during this exodus of modern humans from Africa, departing populations carry only a subset of the diversity that existed in Africa. And this diversity can be cultural, can be phenotypic, can be linguistic, and can be behavioral. Now, migration is sequential, and consequently, the further people are migrating from Africa, the lower is the degree of diversity that these populations will have. And you can see it quite clearly in this illustration. Think about the population in East Africa. You can see the diversity is marked by a larger range of colors. 60 to 90,000 years ago, this population is starting to migrate. Some people are residing in the Fertile Crescent, the area of the Middle East. But these people did not carry the entire diversity that existed in the African population. Why is it so? Because the African population is modest in size, the departing population is small in size, and the departing population, therefore, is not a representative sample of the population that existed in Africa. So the new population that emerges in the Middle East is less diverse than the one in Africa. People are residing there for many years, and at a certain point they start to migrate further because the environment cannot carry the size of the population. Some people are crossing into Europe 45,000 years ago, and again, they carry only a subset of the diversity that existed in the Middle East. Some people are moving eastward and ultimately are crossing the Bering Strait into the America about 25,000 years ago, and into South America 14,000 years ago. And the further they migrate, the less diverse the population is. And as you can see here, the evidence are very striking. Regardless of how you measure diversity along the vertical axis, the further you are from Africa, and this is measured in tens of thousands of kilometers, the less diverse the population is. The most diverse population on planet Earth is in Africa, followed by the Middle Eastern population, European population, Asian population, Oceanian population, and the population in the Americas. And this, as I said, will be true regardless of how you measure diversity. Now, why is it so important? This is in fact critical for the understanding of inequality today. These are events that occurred 60 to 90,000 years ago, and nevertheless they linger in a very important fashion. And this is important because diversity has conflicting effects on prosperity. On the one hand, it has beneficial effects for creativity and innovations. And why is it so? Because it is associated with cross-fertilization of ideas and complementarity of traits in the production process. So the more diverse a society is, the more innovative it is. But on the other hand, diversity is associated with lack of cohesiveness. The more diverse a society is, the less cohesive it is. We see the incidence of mistrust in less diverse society, in more diverse society. We see the incidence of disagreement about the desirable public goods in more diverse societies, and consequently we see more conflicts. And this implies that if there are positive and diminishing effects of diversity on innovations, and if there are positive and diminishing effects of homogeneity on social cohesiveness, then one should expect a hump-shaped relationship between diversity and economic prosperity. Namely, that there will be a sweet spot level of diversity that is associated with productivity. And in fact, the evidence is striking. This is precisely what the data is showing us. So if you look at the 4 panels in front of you, we can see this effect in the Middle Ages, in the first 2 panels, panel A and B. This is based on population density and urbanization. And you can see it in today's world in the context of income per capita. But interestingly enough, in the year 1500, societies that are optimally diverse are China, Korea, and Japan. These are societies that we typically do not associate with an optimal level of diversity. But remember, this is a time period, 1500, in which technological progress is not very rapid, and therefore the benefits of homogeneity in terms of cohesiveness is much more important than the adverse effect or potential adverse effect on innovativeness. But as we move into the modern world, as technological progress becomes more and more rapid, in fact, the peak of the hump, the optimal level of diversity, is associated with the level of diversity in the United States. Namely, in panel C, the country at the peak of the hump is in fact the United States. Namely, as we move forward in the course of human history, more and more diverse societies have the upper hand. And if you think about our projection into the future, if you think about societies that will be more and more advanced technologically, this cultural fluidity will become very important, and diversity as a result of it will be instrumental for coping with rapidly changing technological environment. Now, this is true regardless of whether you look at countries or ethnic groups. In fact, if you focus on all ethnic groups that are present in the ethnographic atlas, you see this pattern of hump-shaped relationship between productivity in the past, 10,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, 1,500 years ago, and in the year 1500, that is present in the data. So what is really important to note is that the wheels of change that I mentioned earlier are rotating in the course of human history. But they are not rotating in a vacuum. They are affected by culture, they are affected by institutions, they are affected by geography, and they are affected by human diversity. So societies that are more diverse are producing more technological progress than otherwise, and the wheels of change are rotating more rapidly than otherwise. Societies with better institutions, again, have better technological progress or faster technological progress because of protection of property rights. Societies that have cultural traits that are representing greater predisposition towards education have lower fertility and consequently changes in the composition of the human population that is conducive for technological progress. So these wheels of change are rotating across the globe, but in different pace. And consequently, when we reach the beginning of the 19th century, some societies are experiencing this rapid change in technological progress that is permitting this tremendous takeoff from stagnation to growth, but others are operating much slower, and consequently their transition is delayed much more than before. So if you ask yourself about the roots of comparative development, how important are historical forces in understanding inequality today? It turns out that 86% of the variations in inequality today can be traced to historical roots. About 17 to 26% are associated with the migration of anatomically modern human from Africa and its impact on diversity. Time since human settlement, predominantly, and the Neolithic Revolution are explaining about 3% of the variation. Geoclimatic factors, about 30% of the variations. The disease environment, about 10% of the variations. Cultural factors, about 20%, and political institutions in the form of executive constraint and polity 4, between 3 and 9%. So this is an holistic view. All factors are important, and these are forces that operated in the distant past. But if we are about to mitigate inequality across the globe, we have to have a better understanding of these forces. Now, as you know, Malthus is famous for his dismal prediction about the evolution of humanities. He suggested that society is doomed to live in poverty because food production is growing arithmetically and population exponentially. And due to Malthus, economics was coined the dismal science. Is this another contribution to the coinage of economics as the dismal science? Not at all. Is history a fate? Not at all. In fact, the idea behind the journey of humanity is that history is not a fate, and by considering our history, we will be in a better position to design a better future. And what does it imply? Growth-enhancing policies, unlike the policies that were implemented in the past decades, will not be universal across societies. There is no one policy that fits all societies at once. They will have to be country-specific, they will have to be history-specific, they will have to be geographic-specific. As I said, one policy does not fit all nations at once. And let me illustrate it in a very simple fashion. If you think about history-dependent, growth-enhancing education policies, naturally we have limited budget. We cannot support every possible education policies, but we would like to use our budgets very effectively. So if you would like to mitigate the cost of diversity, in terms of social non-cohesiveness, and to enhance the benefit of diversity, how can you do it with education policy? Suppose that you focus on a highly diverse society, an African society at the moment. There, you would like basically the education system to reinforce ideas that are associated with respect for difference, respect for other ethnic groups, and ultimately tolerance. This will reduce the cost of diversity and will allow these societies to benefit from the high degree of diversity that is present in the place. But if we focus on highly homogeneous societies, the policy will be precisely the opposite. There, in fact, we would like to use our limited resources to foster the ability of students to challenge the status quo, to think outside of the box. Namely, we would like to generate pluralism in places where pluralism is otherwise absent. Now, if you think about cultural traits, suppose that we focus on a society that is originated in a place on planet Earth where crops were not conducive for agricultural investment. And consequently, we do not see the process of planting and harvesting and planning for the future. In these societies, we have to devote more resources precisely to develop and to foster a future-oriented mindset. We know that the geography was not conducive for the development of future-oriented mindset, and it is our role, or it is the role of society, to mitigate this adverse effect of the environment. And more broadly, when you think about progressive policies, typically when we think about progressive policies, we tend to adopt them because of our moral values. Here, the journey of humanity suggests that many progressive policies are in fact growth enhancing. Namely, we should adopt them because of economic efficiencies. And this can be gender equality, that is critical for the decline in fertility and the transition to modern growth. This can be tolerance, that can reduce the effect of diversity on social cohesiveness, and this can be pluralism, that can increase cross-fertilization of ideas and ultimately allow societies to benefit from diversity. So, thank you very much.